There's a piece of paper sitting in a federal evidence vault in El Paso, Texas. It is a flight manifest, dated July 25, 2024. One private aircraft, 2 passengers, 1 short hop across the border. The names on that manifest belong to 2 men whose families had known each other for almost half a century. One of them was 76 years old and had never spent a single day in an American courtroom. The other was 38 and had grown up calling the older man uncle. By the time that plane touched down on a small airstrip outside El Paso, federal agents were already waiting at the end of the runway. The older man was placed in handcuffs. The younger man walked off the plane on his own. He had brought him in. He had handed him over. He had ended an era that had outlived presidents, outlived wars, outlived every other founding member of the most powerful drug trafficking organization in the Western Hemisphere. My name is Blackwell. I have spent the last 11 years reading bulletins, court filings, autopsy reports, and the kind of internal cartel communications that surface when an organization breaks apart from the inside. I have sat in rooms with retired DEA agents who still will not say certain names out loud. And what I want to walk you through today is not a story about drugs. It is a story about 6 exact days. 6 exact dates on which a king fell. 6 empires that did not end when the king died. They only mutated, splintered, and grew quieter teeth. This is the ledger. 6 funerals, 6 fractures, and the question every cartel asks itself the morning after the king dies: who is next? 6 kings fell, 6 empires shattered. One of them was betrayed by the son of his oldest friend. The first king did not look like a king. He looked like a pharmacist, because he was one. Gilberto Rodríguez Orejuela was born in the small Colombian town of Mariquita in 1939, the eldest of a family that did not have much beyond the small drugstore they ran in the regional capital. He did not grow up watching cartels. There were no cartels yet. He grew up counting pills, stocking aspirin, learning the unglamorous arithmetic of margin and stock turnover. That arithmetic would later make him one of the wealthiest criminals in human history. He had a younger brother named Miguel. The two of them looked nothing like the popular image of a narco. They wore reading glasses, they carried briefcases, they spoke softly. Gilberto had a habit, even when he was at his most powerful, of reviewing balance sheets late into the night with the lamp turned low, pencil in hand, the way an accountant in any small business in any small city would. He was called the chess player. The Colombian press called him el ajedrecista. He earned that name not because he was cold-blooded, although he could be, but because he played a longer game than anyone around him. While Pablo Escobar in Medellin was bombing airliners and assassinating presidential candidates, Gilberto Rodríguez Orejuela was buying banks. He was buying radio stations. He was buying soccer teams. He built a chain of discount drugstores called La Rebaja, and that chain had hundreds of branches across Colombia, and every single branch was a perfectly legitimate-looking enterprise that also happened to launder enormous quantities of cash. The Cali cartel, as it became known, was the Cali cartel because Gilberto and his brother Miguel and a handful of partners ran it from the city of Cali in southwestern Colombia. They ran it like a corporation. They had departments. They had human resources. They had an internal compliance system. They had a security wing that cataloged every vehicle entering and leaving certain neighborhoods and cross-checked the license plates against a database in real time. By the early 1990s, while Escobar was being hunted across Medellin by every law enforcement agency on 3 continents, the Cali cartel had quietly captured almost the entire wholesale market that Medellin was losing. When Pablo Escobar finally died on a rooftop in December of 1993, the Cali cartel was already moving roughly 80% of the cocaine entering the United States. Time magazine put Gilberto Rodríguez Orejuela on its cover. He was, by some estimates, generating $7 billion a year. The Colombian government was so deeply penetrated by Cali money that congressional campaigns, presidential campaigns, judges, prosecutors, federal police commanders, entire branches of the state were on a payroll that ran out of a discount pharmacy. Then came the morning of June 9th, 1995. A team of Colombian search block commandos surrounded a residential building in the upscale Santa Monica neighborhood of Cali. They knew Gilberto was inside because his security system had failed just once, just for an hour, and that hour had been enough. When the door came down, he did not run. He did not pull a weapon. He was found inside a custom-built closet behind a false wall, and when the agents pulled him out, he was wearing a sweater and reading glasses, and he simply held up his hands. Blackwell has read the transcript of his arrest. There is no shouting in it. There is no defiance. There is one sentence, almost polite. He said, "You have me." The Colombian government held him for 9 years before extraditing him to the United States in 2004, alongside his brother Miguel. They were prosecuted in Miami and pled guilty to running a continuing criminal enterprise. Gilberto received a sentence of 30 years. He served it in a federal medical facility in North Carolina. He died there on May 31st, 2022, from cancer at the age of 83. He never saw Cali again. He never saw the drugstore his family had run. And here's the part that matters more than the man. The Cali cartel did not die when Gilberto died. It did not even die when he was arrested. It fragmented. The internal departments, the logistics group, the security group, the financial group, the production group, each of those broke off and became its own smaller organization. The Colombian press eventually came to call them Los Cartelitos, the little cartels. There were 6 of them. They were harder to track because they were smaller. They were harder to negotiate with because there was no longer a single chess player at the top who could be reasoned with. They were harder to dismantle because cutting off one head no longer mattered. The pharmacist had built a corporation. When the corporation broke apart, the pieces did not stop functioning. They just became impossible to map. Gilberto Rodríguez Orejuela died in a federal prison hospital. The market he built kept running without him. That is the first lesson Blackwell wants you to hold on to, because every other king on this list teaches the same lesson in a different language. The structure outlives the structure's name. The second king was killed by a police officer who did not know he had just killed a king. Ramón Arellano Félix was born in Sinaloa, Mexico in 1964, one of 7 brothers who would, between them, run the city of Tijuana and the entire western corridor of the Mexico-California border for a generation. The Arellano Félix brothers inherited their territory from an older man named Miguel Ángel Félix Gallardo, who is sometimes called the godfather of modern Mexican trafficking. When Félix Gallardo was arrested in 1989, he made a decision from inside prison. He divided the country. He gave Tijuana to his nephews, the Arellano Félix brothers. He gave Ciudad Juárez to a man named Amado Carrillo Fuentes. He gave the Pacific Corridor to a young Sinaloan named Joaquín Guzmán Loera, who would later become known as El Chapo. The Arellano Félix family, in other words, was handed an empire. They did not have to build it. They only had to keep it. And in the 1990s, they did keep it, with a level of violence that even other Mexican cartels found shocking. Ramón was the enforcer. He was the brother who handled the killing. His brothers Benjamín and Javier handled the politics, the business, the structure. Ramón handled the discipline. He cultivated relationships with street gangs in San Diego, particularly a Logan Heights crew called the Calle 30, and he used those gangs as a deniable arm of his organization on the American side of the border. He was responsible, by the most conservative estimates, for hundreds of deaths across both sides of the line during the 1990s, including, and this is the event that put him on the radar of every law enforcement agency in North America, the killing of Cardinal Juan Jesus Posadas Ocampo at the Guadalajara airport in May of 1993. The cardinal was caught in a crossfire that, by most reconstructions, was actually an attempt by Ramon's people to kill El Chapo. They missed. The cardinal died instantly. He died from gunfire at the front of his vehicle, a Catholic prince of the church killed in a botched cartel hit at a Mexican international airport in broad daylight. That single event made the Arellano Félix name unburyable. After Posadas Ocampo, every Mexican administration that came after felt obligated to do something about Tijuana. Ramón became the most wanted Mexican fugitive of the late 1990s. He spent years moving between safe houses in Tijuana, Guadalajara, and Mazatlan. He had multiple plastic surgeries to alter his face. He carried false identification at all times. He stopped using phones. He communicated through couriers. And then, on the morning of February 10th, 2002, he made one mistake. He drove a vehicle through a routine traffic checkpoint in Mazatlan during the city's annual carnival. The officer who flagged him down was a municipal patrolman named Juan Bautista Ortiz. Officer Ortiz had no reason to suspect anything. He was working crowd control. He saw a vehicle with tinted windows and a driver who would not produce his identification, and he asked the driver to step out. Ramón Arellano Félix opened fire. Officer Ortiz, by every account from that day, was a man who had been on the force for less than a year, who had no specialized training, who was wearing a basic uniform and carrying a service pistol. He returned fire. He hit Ramón once in the chest and once in the head. The man who had ordered the deaths of hundreds of people, who had survived 2 countries' worth of federal task forces, who had eluded arrest for almost a decade, was killed by a young patrol officer who genuinely did not realize until the body was identified hours later in a Mazatlan morgue what he had just done. Ramon's brother Benjamin was arrested 1 month after that, in March of 2002, in Puebla. His brother Javier was captured in 2006 on a sport fishing boat off the coast of Baja California. His brother Eduardo was captured in 2008. The Tijuana Plaza, which had once been one of the 3 pillars of Mexican trafficking, fell into the hands of remnants who tried to keep it running. They could not. By 2008, the plaza had effectively been absorbed by the rising Sinaloa cartel under El Chapo. The Arellano Félix organization, as American prosecutors had learned to call it, simply ceased to exist as an independent entity. The brothers had inherited an empire. They had run it with extraordinary brutality, and it ended on a carnival street in Mazatlan, with a patrol officer who did not even know he had won. The third king died in a 2-hour gun battle in a luxury apartment in Cuernavaca, and when his body was finally pulled out of the rubble, his pants had been pulled down to his knees, and a man was standing over him taking a photograph. Arturo Beltrán Leyva was born in 1961 in the small mountain municipality of Badiraguato in the state of Sinaloa, in the same dirt road country that produced El Chapo, that produced El Mayo, that produced more of the founding generation of modern Mexican trafficking than any other single municipality in the country. Arturo and his brothers Alfredo, Carlos, Hector, and Mario grew up alongside Joaquín Guzmán Loera. They were childhood friends. They marched together. They worked the same opium fields as teenagers. They moved up through the same trafficking hierarchy in the 1980s under the protection of Miguel Ángel Félix Gallardo. When Félix Gallardo divided the country in 1989, Arturo and his brothers stayed with the Sinaloa side, working under and alongside El Chapo, eventually becoming one of the most important enforcement and logistics arms of the entire Sinaloa cartel. For almost 20 years, the Beltrán Leyva brothers were Sinaloa. They handled corruption of federal officials. They handled the cartel's intelligence wing. They handled relationships with Colombian suppliers. They were not the public face. El Chapo was the public face. They were the operating system underneath it. And then, in January of 2008, Mexican federal forces arrested Alfredo Beltrán Leyva, the brother known as El Mochomo, in Culiacán. The arrest happened cleanly, too cleanly. Arturo Beltrán Leyva was convinced, and Blackwell has read the internal communications that surfaced years later, that El Chapo himself had given his brother up to the federal government in exchange for breathing room on a different front. Arturo declared war. The split was instant and total. The Beltrán Leyva brothers walked out of Sinaloa and took with them a piece of the cartel's enforcement structure, a piece of its corruption network, and a piece of its political reach. They aligned themselves with Los Zetas, which we will come to in a moment, and they began a campaign of assassinations and kidnappings against everyone they believed had been involved in Alfredo's arrest. The level of violence in Mexico in 2008 and 2009 spiked to levels the country had not seen in modern history, and a substantial fraction of that spike was directly attributable to the Beltrán Leyva war against Sinaloa. Arturo took up residence in the state of Morelos, just south of Mexico City, in a cluster of luxury apartments and rural ranches that he kept rotating through. He held parties. He hired norteño bands to play live performances inside his compound. He paid off the Morelos State Attorney General's office, the federal police regional commander, the local mayors, half a dozen federal congressmen, and a sitting member of the executive cabinet's security advisory team. By 2009, by some estimates, the Beltrán Leyva organization had more federal officials on its payroll than any other criminal organization in the country. He called himself El Jefe de Jefes, the boss of bosses. He believed he was untouchable. On the evening of December 16, 2009, the Mexican Navy's elite Marine Special Forces unit, SAMAR, surrounded a luxury apartment building in the altitude complex in Cuernavaca. They had been given the location by an informant whose identity has never been publicly confirmed, but whom Blackwell believes, based on subsequent court testimony, was connected to the Sinaloa side of the war. The Marines arrived in force: helicopters, armored vehicles, more than 200 personnel. They began evacuating the rest of the building. Arturo's security team, roughly 15 heavily armed bodyguards, opened fire from inside the apartment. The gun battle lasted approximately 2 hours. The Marines used grenades. The Marines used heavy machine guns. The walls of the apartment were perforated to the point that, in some sections, daylight was visible from inside. When the Marines finally entered the apartment, Arturo Beltrán Leyva was dead on the floor of the master bedroom. The Marines, some of whom had lost colleagues in the firefight, then did something that the Mexican Navy has officially never explained. They pulled down his pants. They placed cash and gold jewelry on his exposed body, and they photographed him. The photographs leaked to the press within 48 hours. The image of the boss of bosses, half undressed, surrounded by cartel bling staged on his corpse, became one of the most widely circulated photographs in modern Mexican press history. 4 days later, a Mexican naval officer named Melquisedec Angulo Cordova, who had been killed in the Cuernavaca operation, was buried with full honors in his hometown in Tabasco. That same night, gunmen entered the home of his mother, his aunt, his sister, and his brother, and executed all 4 of them in retaliation. The Beltrán Leyva organization survived Arturo's death by approximately 5 years. His brother Héctor took over and ran a smaller version of the operation until he surrendered to American authorities in 2014. His brother Carlos was arrested in 2009. His brother Mario had already died years earlier. The organization fragmented into smaller cells, the most prominent of which is now known as the Guerreros Unidos, who would later become infamous for their involvement in the disappearance of 43 students in Iguala, Guerrero, in 2014. Arturo Beltrán Leyva believed he was the boss of bosses. The Marines who killed him pulled down his pants and took a picture. And the war he started against his childhood friend never actually ended. It is still going on, right now, as you watch this. Inside the state of Sinaloa, the 4th king was killed at a baseball game in a small town in the state of Coahuila. And 12 hours later, his body disappeared from the funeral home where it was being held. And to this day, there are people in northeastern Mexico who do not believe he is actually dead. Heriberto Lazcano was born in 1974 in the city of Pachuca in the central Mexican state of Hidalgo. He did not come from a trafficking family. He did not grow up in the Sierra Madre. He grew up in a working-class neighborhood, finished basic schooling, and at the age of 17, he enlisted in the Mexican army. He was selected for the Special Forces. He trained in the elite Grupo Aeromóvil de Fuerzas Especiales, the GAFE, which is roughly the Mexican equivalent of an American Special Operations Unit. The GAFE received training, in some cases, from American Special Forces personnel and from Israeli counterterrorism advisors. They were trained in close-quarters combat, in airborne insertion, in counter-narcotics operations, in interrogation, and in the kind of small-unit infantry tactics that elite militaries reserve for their best soldiers. In 1998, Heriberto Lazcano deserted. He did not desert alone. He deserted with 30 other GAFE soldiers, all of whom had been recruited by a man named Osiel Cardenas Guillen, who was, at the time, the head of the Gulf Cartel, operating out of Matamoros on the Texas border. Cardenas Guillen had decided that he wanted his own private military, and he had concluded that the most cost-effective way to get one was to bribe an entire cell of the Mexican army to come work for him. The price was, by the standards of cartel economics, almost insultingly low. The defectors became known internally as Los Zetas because their original radio call sign in the GAFE had been the letter Z. For the first 6 years of their existence, Los Zetas were not an independent cartel. They were the armed wing of the Gulf Cartel. They were enforcers. They were bodyguards. They handled assassinations. They handled kidnappings. They trained the Gulf Cartel's lower-level personnel in military tactics. And then, sometime around 2004, Heriberto Lazcano, who had risen through the ranks of the Zetas to become their senior operational commander, made a decision that would transform Mexican organized crime forever. He decided that the Zetas would no longer work for the Gulf Cartel. They would become their own organization. The split, which finalized in 2010 after years of internal tension, was extraordinarily violent. The Gulf Cartel and the Zetas, who had spent a decade together, turned on each other across the entire eastern half of Mexico. The bodies that piled up in the cities of Reynosa, Matamoros, Nuevo Laredo, and Monterrey during the 2010 and 2011 period were almost all attributable to that single internal split. And under Lazcano's command, the Zetas pioneered a style of operation that previous Mexican cartels had not used. They beheaded their victims publicly. They left signed messages on the bodies. They posted videos of executions online. They expanded the cartel's revenue streams beyond drug trafficking to include extortion of every small business in the territories they controlled, kidnapping of migrants moving north toward the United States, theft of crude oil from Pemex pipelines, and human trafficking. By 2011, the Zetas controlled, by some estimates, half of Mexico. They were active in 23 of the 31 Mexican states. They had cells in Guatemala, Honduras, El Salvador, and Belize. They were the largest and most geographically distributed cartel in the country's history. Lazcano was known internally as Z3, his original Zetas designation, or as El Lazca. He was not flashy. He did not give interviews. He did not cultivate a public image the way Pablo Escobar or El Chapo had. He moved constantly between safe houses across the northeastern Mexican states, surrounded by a small bodyguard detail of fellow former GAFE personnel. He was, in operational terms, the most professional Mexican cartel boss of his generation. On the afternoon of October 7, 2012, Heriberto Lazcano attended a baseball game in the small town of Progreso in the state of Coahuila. He was unarmed. He was traveling with a single bodyguard. The Mexican Marines, conducting what they later described as a routine patrol unrelated to any specific intelligence about Lazcano's location, encountered his vehicle on a road near the stadium. Shots were exchanged. Lazcano and his bodyguard were both killed in the ensuing firefight, which lasted less than 10 minutes. The Marines did not know, at the time of the shooting, who they had killed. Fingerprints taken at the scene matched military service records from the GAFE. The body was transported to a small funeral home in nearby Sabinas, Coahuila, pending formal identification. That night, sometime between approximately 10 in the evening and 4 in the morning, an armed group entered the funeral home, overpowered the staff at gunpoint, and removed Heriberto Lazcano's body. By the time Mexican federal authorities arrived at the funeral home the following morning, the body was gone. It has never been recovered. DNA testing on tissue samples taken before the body was removed eventually confirmed the identification. The Mexican government formally announced Lazcano's death 3 days after the encounter. But for years afterward, in towns across northeastern Mexico, there were sightings. There were rumors. There were graffiti messages on highway overpasses signed Z3 Still Alive. The Zetas, after Lazcano's death, fractured. The organization split into 2 main factions: the Cartel del Noreste, run by his former lieutenant Miguel Treviño Morales until his arrest in 2013, and the so-called Old School Zetas, who tried to maintain the original organization's structure. Both factions are still active. Neither one controls the territory that Lazcano controlled at his peak. The unified Zetas of 2011 no longer exist. What replaced them is smaller, more fractured, and harder to map. Exactly the same outcome that the Cali cartel had produced 2 decades earlier when Gilberto Rodríguez Orejuela was arrested. Heriberto Lazcano was killed at a baseball game on a routine patrol. His body was stolen 12 hours later. And the cartel he built mutated into half a dozen smaller organizations that the Mexican state still has not finished fighting. He took a piece of the army, he turned it into a cartel, and when he died, the army got pieces of it back, but not all of it. Some of it is still out there. Some of it never came home. The 5th king died twice. The Mexican government announced his death on December 9, 2010, after a gun battle in the mountains of Michoacán. They did not produce a body. They claimed his followers had taken the body away during the firefight to prevent capture. They closed the file, they moved on. And then, for the next 3.5 years, Nazario Moreno Gonzalez continued to run his cartel from the grave. Nazario Moreno was born in 1970 in the small town of Apatzingan in the western Mexican state of Michoacán, in a region of avocado orchards and lime plantations that has produced more cartel leadership in the last 20 years than almost any other agricultural region in the country. He grew up poor. He had 9 siblings. He left home as a teenager and migrated illegally into the United States, where he worked agricultural jobs in Central California through most of the 1990s. While in California, he had a religious conversion. He attended a series of evangelical Christian congregations. He became, by every account, intensely devout. He read religious literature obsessively, including the works of an American evangelical writer named John Eldredge, particularly Eldredge's book Wild at Heart, which Nazario Moreno would later quote from extensively in cartel propaganda. In the early 2000s, he returned to Michoacán a changed man. He was no longer the unremarkable migrant farm worker who had left a decade earlier. He had a vision. He believed that he had been called to redeem his home state from what he saw as the moral collapse caused by methamphetamine, by trafficking, by Zeta's incursion, and by what he called the corruption of traditional Michoacán values. He started, with a handful of partners, a small trafficking organization called La Familia Michoacana. La Familia Michoacana was, from its founding, unlike any cartel before it. Nazario Moreno wrote his own scripture. He published a book called Pensamientos, Thoughts, which was distributed to every member of the cartel and which combined evangelical Christian language with cartel ideology, with selections from John Eldredge, with passages he had written himself. He required new members to read it. He required them to attend prayer sessions. He required them to abstain from drug use, from alcohol, from extramarital relationships. He executed members who failed his moral code. He marketed La Familia to the people of Michoacán not as a cartel, but as a moral defense force, claiming to protect lime farmers and avocado growers from extortion by the Zetas, while simultaneously extorting those same farmers himself. He called himself El Más Loco, the craziest one. He commissioned songs about himself. He distributed pamphlets across the state with his portrait on them. He developed the kind of personality cult that no Mexican cartel boss before him had ever attempted. By 2009, La Familia Michoacana was the dominant criminal organization in Michoacán. It controlled meth production for export to the United States. It controlled lime taxation. It controlled avocado export taxation. It controlled local police forces in a substantial fraction of the state's municipalities. In December 2010, Mexican federal forces engaged a group of La Familia gunmen in a series of firefights across rural Michoacán. After several days of fighting, the federal government announced that Nazario Moreno had been killed. They produced witnesses who claimed to have seen the body. They did not produce the body itself. They explained that his followers had recovered it and had likely buried it in the mountains. The case was closed. La Familia Michoacana, in the months after Nazario's announced death, formally dissolved. In its place rose a new organization, calling itself the Knights Templar Cartel, Los Caballeros Templarios. The new organization adopted explicitly medieval Christian iconography. Members swore oaths on a copy of a code modeled after the historical Knights Templars' rule. They wore white tunics with red crosses during initiation ceremonies. They built shrines in towns across Michoacán dedicated to a figure they called the Saint, El Santo, a martyred founder who had died defending the people of Michoacán. The face on those shrines was Nazario Moreno's. He was not dead. Nazario Moreno had survived the December 2010 encounter. He had used the announcement of his own death as a strategic withdrawal. He had relocated to the deepest rural areas of Michoacán's hotlands. He continued to run the rebranded cartel from hiding for the next 3.5 years, communicating through couriers, appearing personally only at carefully secured rural meetings, and exploiting the fact that the federal government had officially declared him dead and was therefore no longer actively hunting him. The discovery that he was still alive came gradually. By 2013, Mexican military intelligence had concluded that the Knights Templar were being run by Nazario Moreno in person. The federal government did not publicly acknowledge this conclusion. They quietly resumed the hunt. On March 9, 2014, Mexican Marines and federal police forces engaged a small group of armed men in the rural municipality of Tumbiscatillo, Michoacán. The firefight was brief. When it ended, 3 men were dead. Fingerprints, dental records, and DNA testing confirmed that one of those men was Nazario Moreno Gonzalez. This time, the body was recovered. This time, the body was photographed. This time, the federal government held a press conference and displayed the evidence. He had died, officially, on March 9, 2014. He had also died, officially, on December 9, 2010. The shrines built to him as El Santo were demolished by federal forces over the next 18 months. The Knights Templar cartel fractured almost immediately, splitting into smaller groups, most of which were absorbed within 2 years by the Cartel Jalisco Nueva Generación, which was rapidly expanding eastward from Jalisco. The personality cult dissolved. The pamphlets stopped being distributed. The white tunics with red crosses were abandoned. Nothing remained of his organization within 5 years of his second death. Except, in some rural communities of Michoacán, you can still find old portraits of him hanging in private homes. People still light candles. The man who wrote his own scripture, who built a cult around himself, who died and resurrected and died again, is remembered in a handful of farming villages as a saint who tried to save them. He extorted those same villages while alive. The shrines remember the protection. They do not remember the extortion. That is what he built. That is what survived him. Memory, falsified, surviving the man who falsified it. The 6th king did not die. He surrendered. He surrendered because he was put on a plane by a man whose father had founded the cartel alongside him 50 years earlier, and whose godson he had personally raised. Ismael Zambada Garcia, known across the trafficking world simply as El Mayo, was born in 1948 in the small farming community of El Alamo in the foothills of the Sierra Madre Occidental in the state of Sinaloa. He grew up in dirt poverty. His family farmed corn and beans on a small plot of land. As a teenager, he began moving small quantities of marijuana on burros across the mountains, working for older traffickers who had been operating the same routes for generations. He was not formally educated. He never finished primary school. He spent his entire adult life within a roughly 200-mile radius of his birthplace. He never owned a passport by every available account. He never traveled abroad. He never gave a public interview, with one exception in 2010 when he agreed to a single conversation with the journalist Julio Scherer Garcia in an undisclosed location in the Sinaloan mountains, a conversation that produced a brief published piece and from which Zambada immediately disappeared again. There is, to public knowledge, exactly one verified photograph of him from the past 4 decades, and it is the photograph from his arrest. Everything else is speculation. He helped found, alongside El Chapo and a small group of other Sinaloan traffickers, the organization that would become the Sinaloa Cartel in the late 1980s. From the founding generation, El Mayo was always the strategic counterweight to El Chapo's flamboyance. Where Chapo wanted publicity, El Mayo demanded silence. Where Chapo built tunnels and escaped from prisons in laundry carts, El Mayo lived on a working ranch and slept under different roofs every night. Where Chapo cultivated narco corridos and television interviews, El Mayo refused to be photographed at all. He outlived everyone. He outlived Pablo Escobar in 1993. He outlived Amado Carrillo Fuentes in 1997. He outlived Ramón Arellano Félix in 2002. He outlived Arturo Beltrán Leyva in 2009. He outlived Heriberto Lazcano in 2012. He outlived Nazario Moreno's first death in 2010 and his second death in 2014. He survived El Chapo's first capture in 1993. He survived El Chapo's first prison escape in 2001. He survived El Chapo's second capture in 2014. He survived El Chapo's second prison escape in 2015. He survived El Chapo's third and final capture in 2016, and El Chapo's extradition to the United States in 2017, and El Chapo's life sentence in 2019. After El Chapo's extradition, El Mayo became the sole surviving founding member of the Sinaloa cartel's original generation. Every other man who had stood in the room when the cartel was founded was either dead, in an American prison, or in a Mexican prison serving sentences they would not survive. He was the last one standing. He was 76 years old. He had been moving narcotics for almost 6 decades. He had never spent a single day in custody anywhere. He had a son named Vicente, who was arrested in 2009 and is currently cooperating with American prosecutors. He had a son named Ismael Jr., who was extradited to the United States in 2019 and pled guilty. He had relationships with every Sinaloa-aligned trafficker active across northern Mexico. He had a personal physician who traveled with him at all times. He had, by the estimates of American prosecutors, generated more revenue from narcotics trafficking across his lifetime than any other living person on Earth. And he had, for almost 50 years, been protected by a single unwritten rule. The Sinaloa cartel was a federation. The federation had 2 heads, El Chapo and El Mayo. As long as both heads were intact, the federation held. After Chapo's extradition, only one head remained, and the question that began circulating internally in the years after 2017 was simple: who would inherit? Chapo had 4 sons who were active in the organization. They became known collectively as Los Chapitos. The eldest, Ivan Archivaldo, ran the family's flagship operations. Joaquin Guzman Lopez, the second son, handled logistics and finance. He was 38 years old by 2024. He was, in the cultural and personal sense, El Mayo's godson. El Mayo had stood in the church at his baptism. El Mayo had attended his confirmation. El Mayo had visited the family for birthdays, for funerals, for graduations. There was, by every available account from defectors who later cooperated with American authorities, genuine personal affection between the older man and the younger one. Joaquin Guzman Lopez had grown up calling Ismael Zambada uncle. On the morning of July 25, 2024, Joaquin Guzman Lopez contacted Ismael Zambada and asked him to attend a meeting at a private location in northern Sinaloa. The meeting, as Zambada was led to understand it, concerned a political dispute in the state of Sinaloa, specifically a question about which gubernatorial candidate the cartel would support in upcoming elections. Zambada arrived at the meeting, accompanied by a small bodyguard detail. Joaquin Guzman Lopez was waiting for him. There was no political meeting. There was a small private aircraft on a runway. Zambada was, according to the version of events later reconstructed by American prosecutors and corroborated in part by El Mayo's own attorneys, taken to the runway under duress. He was placed on the aircraft took off. It did not land in Sinaloa. It did not land anywhere in Mexico. It landed at a small airport outside El Paso, Texas. American federal agents were waiting. Zambada was arrested as he stepped off the plane. Joaquin Guzman Lopez was also arrested, but the nature of his arrest, the physical posture, the absence of a struggle, and the fact that he had personally chartered the aircraft made it clear within hours to anyone who understood the structure of the cartel that this had not been a capture. This had been a delivery. The cooperation agreement between Joaquin Guzman Lopez and the United States Department of Justice has been, as of the production of this video, kept partially under seal. What is publicly known is that he handed over El Mayo as part of a negotiation to reduce sentences for himself and for at least 2 of his brothers, all of whom had been facing capital narcotics charges in American federal court. The man who had survived Pablo Escobar, who had survived Amado Carrillo, who had survived the Arellano Félix brothers, who had survived Beltrán Leyva, who had survived Lazcano, who had survived Nazario Moreno, who had survived 2 captures and 2 prison escapes by his own founding partner, had been brought down by the son of his oldest friend, asking him to come to a meeting that did not exist. Within 72 hours of the arrests, the state of Sinaloa entered open civil war. The faction loyal to Zambada, who became known as Los Mayos, declared war on the faction loyal to the Guzman family, who became known as Los Chapitos. The fighting that began in late July 2024 and continued through the production of this video has, by conservative estimates, killed more than 1,500 people in the state of Sinaloa alone. Schools have been closed for months at a time. Businesses in Culiacan have shut down for weeks. The Mexican army has been deployed in numbers not seen since the height of the Calderón administration's drug war 15 years earlier. The cartel that El Mayo and El Chapo founded together in 1989 has, for all practical purposes, ceased to exist as a unified organization. What remains is 2 armed factions inside one state, fighting each other for control of routes, plazas, and political relationships, while a third faction, the Cartel Jalisco Nueva Generación, under El Mencho, watches from the west and prepares to inherit whatever is left when the dust settles. Ismael Zambada, as of the production of this video, is being held in a federal facility in the Eastern District of New York. He has pled not guilty. He is 77 years old. His attorneys have filed a motion arguing that his transportation to American soil was conducted in violation of international law and constitutes a forcible abduction rather than a legal extradition. The motion is unlikely to succeed. He will, by every probable outcome, die in American federal custody. The man who survived everyone died, finally, not because someone hunted him, but because someone he had loved chose to sell him. 6 men, 6 dates, 6 funerals, most of them. The Cali cartel fragmented into 6 little cartels that no government has ever fully mapped. The Tijuana Plaza was absorbed by Sinaloa within a decade, and the brothers who inherited an empire from Félix Gallardo died or surrendered one by one. The Beltrán Leyva organization, born from a betrayal between childhood friends, fractured into smaller cells whose deeds include some of the worst atrocities of the post-2010 period. The Zetas, who took a piece of the Mexican army and turned it into a cartel, splintered into competing factions that the Mexican state still has not finished fighting. The Knights Templar cartel dissolved into Cartel Jalisco fodder within a year of Nazario Moreno's second death, and the shrines built to him were torn down by federal forces. The Sinaloa cartel, the largest and oldest and most strategically sophisticated of the Mexican trafficking organizations, is currently in open civil war on its own home soil, with no resolution in sight and a body count rising every month. The empires did not die when the kings died. They divided, and every division made them harder to kill. That is the lesson Blackwell wants you to take from these 6 funerals. When an empire is built on a structural demand the law cannot reach, and the demand for these substances is structural, has been structural for 50 years, will be structural for another 50, the death of the king does not solve the problem. The death of the king only resets the problem. Smaller, faster, quieter. With more people involved and fewer central figures to negotiate with or extradite or photograph on the floor of a Cuernavaca apartment with their pants pulled down. Every captured boss is replaced by 2 ambitious lieutenants. Every fragmented cartel is replaced by half a dozen smaller organizations. Every funeral makes the next funeral harder to schedule, because there are more candidates distributed across more cities, hidden behind more cutouts. The man who built a corporation out of a drugstore died in a North Carolina prison hospital. The enforcer of Tijuana was killed by a patrol officer who did not know whom he had killed. The boss of bosses was photographed on the floor of his own apartment with cash and gold staged on his half-dressed corpse. The deserter who built Los Zetas was killed at a baseball game, and his body was stolen 12 hours later and never returned. The cult leader who wrote his own scripture died, was resurrected, and died again, and the shrines his followers built were demolished by Marines. And the 76-year-old farm boy who had outlived everyone, who had never been photographed, who had never spent a day in custody anywhere on Earth, was put on a private plane in northern Sinaloa by his godson, the son of his oldest friend, and handed to American agents at the end of a runway in Texas. 6 kings, 6 dates, 6 fractures. The empires kept running. The trade did not pause. Not for a day, not for an hour. The market is still open. It opened this morning. It will be open tomorrow. Somewhere in northern Sinaloa right now, 2 factions are still shooting at each other over the question of who inherits a man who has not yet been convicted. Somewhere in Michoacan right now, a teenager is being recruited into a cell that did not exist 5 years ago, that traces its lineage through 3 previous organizations, the original founders of all of which are dead. Somewhere in Tamaulipas right now, a lieutenant of a lieutenant of a lieutenant is making the same calculation that Heriberto Lazcano made in 2004. He is asking himself why he should keep working for the man above him when he could simply become that man. The answer he reaches will determine the next funeral, and the funeral after that, and the funeral after that. Every empire on this list was built by a man who believed he could not be replaced. Every empire on this list is now being run by people whose names he will not know for another 5 years, until the next list is made. Until the next 6 funerals are scheduled. Until the next plane lands at the end of the next runway with the next king on board, brought there by the next person he had loved and trusted enough to follow into a meeting that did not exist. That is the structure. That is what Blackwell sees 11 years into reading these files. The kings die. The structure does not. The structure is the demand. and the demand has not lost a single customer in 50 years. If you have followed this far, the previous galleries on this channel walk through the most powerful drug lords by personal wealth, the most violent killers by individual victim count, and the longest-running trafficking dynasties by family generation. The next gallery, posting next week, walks through the mafia families of America, Italy, and Japan, and the exact dates on which their bosses fell. Same structure. 6 men, 6 funerals. One question: who inherits? Subscribe if you want to be there when the list is read. The next king is already alive. He is already moving. He just does not know yet which day will be his date.